Tier rankings are about real prosecutions, real prevention, and real protection for real people who are suffering as slaves. Cuba is an egregious example of a nation being given an unwarranted passing grade because of other non-human trafficking considerations. Just read the report. The report leads you to the inevitable conclusion: stamp it, Tier 3, egregious violator. Yet, President Obama is there today, hobnobbing with the very people who are kept in power by the profits of slave labor. The very people who do not have a law against labor trafficking, because of course it doesn't exist. The very people whose hotels are filled with sex tourists who come to Cuba specifically to sexually exploit minors. My latest trafficking law, it's the fourth so far, the International Megan's Law, fights sex tourism, but assumes a willing, non-profiting partner country. Some tourists go to Cuba because Cuba facilitates sex trafficking. Cuba also harbors criminals. Just ask the family of Warren Forrester, a New Jersey state trooper who was gunned down at a traffic stop by Joanne Chesimard. Cuba protects Chesimard to this day. Maria Werlau will testify this afternoon that, and I quote, "What makes the Cuban case unique as well as astounding is that trafficking is a huge operation run by the government through numerous state enterprises with accomplices, participants, sponsors, and promoters all over the world. And that the Cuban dictatorship is involved in, quote, 4 main sources of human trafficking: export services for temporary workers, forced labor and sex trafficking, state-sponsored or forced migration, and export sales of human and body parts." Our State Department Trafficking in Persons report, however, addresses only 2 of these aspects, and in my view, does it quite poorly, she says in her testimony. The trafficking rankings should not be used as cheap chips and sweeteners that could be compromised in the hope of bringing about better governmental relations with Cuba or any other nation. Rather, better relations with Cuba or any other nation should be preconditioned on real protection for Cuba's prostituted children and women and recognition of labor trafficking. The President, it seems to me, is lending his stature, particularly as a Nobel Peace Prize winner, to the very people who are imprisoning human rights advocates at a higher rate than ever. Cuba's actions prove once again that lifting accountability only emboldens evil.
In Cuba, it was ranked not free in Freedom in the World, with a 7 for political rights and a 6 for civil liberties. It hasn't made much progress whatsoever, despite the resumption of diplomatic relations. It was raised to Tier 2 watch list, and that raised some eyebrows properly. Profoundly unfree conditions for workers without an independent voice from state power, and the raucous sex trade that Chairman Smith has already referred to, marketed to tourists abroad, remain reasons for close examination.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to offer this testimony. Please allow me a few words about the grave situation of Baptist Pastor Mario Felix Leonard, husband and father of 2 children, arrested Sunday at noon, a few hours before President Obama arrived in Cuba. He's quite ill and suspicious of a needle prick he received in the arm from a stranger some days ago, after which he developed some puzzling symptoms that have worsened. I have photos of his arrest as well as of his arm. His wife is under arrest. I've been in communication with her through her cell phone. The pastor has refused to eat or drink since yesterday morning. He does not feel safe in Cuba, and I believe he's not safe in Cuba, where several activists have died in the state-run facilities in questionable circumstances and surrounded by the secret police. I call on President Obama and Secretary Kerry to request his immediate release and that he be brought to the United States with his family for immediate medical treatment, hopefully with our huge official delegation or before it leaves Cuba. Now, on the topic of this hearing, I will speak about Cuba based on considerable research over the last 6 years on human trafficking and exploitation. Let me briefly address some key issues the committee is considering. 1, what is Cuba's track record, particularly in the last year, in fighting human trafficking? I consider 4 main sources of human trafficking in Cuba. 1 is the export services of temporary workers. 2, forced labor and sex trafficking. 3, state-sponsored or forced migration. And 4, the export sale of human and body parts. Cuba derives most of its revenues from the export services of temporary workers and forced migration. Our State Department's Trafficking in Persons report addressed only 2 of these aspects for Cuba, and in my view, disappointingly. They do not pay attention to the other 2. Contrary to fighting human trafficking, the Cuban government is itself likely one of the largest and most profitable traffickers in the world. This business has been growing enormously and exponentially, especially in the last 10 years. What makes the Cuban case unique as well as astounding is that trafficking is a huge operation run through numerous state enterprises, with, for the most part, accomplices, participants, sponsors, and promoters all over the world, including from well-known corporations, large foundations, key international agencies, and some of the leading world democracies, including ours as of late. Regarding the export labor force, it is quite diversified and consists of generally highly qualified temporary workers, doctors and other health professionals, teachers, sports trainers, engineers, construction workers, entertainers, sailors, scientists, architects, engineers, etc. They can be dispatched overseas at short notice and are oftentimes sent as part of labor brigades. The greater part of their wages go to the Cuban government. Many different services are sold through large state entities, including 2 very large health conglomerates and 84 smaller state entities. It is a huge and expanding business. The latest official data for the year 2011 indicates that Cuba's export services net of tourism grew from $1.5 billion in 2003 to $7.8 billion in 2011. Last year, reports from Cuban officials put the annual figure at around $8.2 billion. From tourism, Cuba derives, to give you a comparative idea, $2.5 billion a year. So it's almost 3 times, or it's over 3 times. It's impossible to tell how many Cuban workers are involved from conflicting official reports, but around 65,000, perhaps more, are said to serve in 91 countries. 75% of those, or close to 50,000, are in the health sector. This is according to different reports from Cuban officials. It's not official data published. Cuba's business of exporting indentured workers and its unique brand of health diplomacy are only possible in a totalitarian state in which a pool of guaranteed captive, low-paid workers can be exploited as exportable commodities. Violations are too numerous to list here, but amply documented in my published work and more detailed in my written testimony. In my mind, there is no doubt the practice constitutes a form of slavery and violates many international agreements to which Cuba and most countries where these workers serve as parties, including the trafficking protocols. Regarding state-sponsored or forced migration, this is not a usual form of human trafficking by its state per se, but it is taking place at a very large scale and results from direct and indirect practices of the Cuban state that force, push, and or enable its desperate citizens to migrate in the tens of thousands each year. It alleviates political and economic pressure on the government and generates billions in revenues from assorted fees and assistance from the ever-growing diaspora, which just from the United States alone is estimating to be sending over $5 billion a year. I have anecdotal evidence of elaborate criminal schemes run covertly by operatives or agents of the regime that merit further investigation by the appropriate authorities. I understand that certain U.S. law enforcement agencies have looked into this and have specific cases under investigation. The mass migration has been fueled in recent years by three factors. One, a huge outflow through Ecuador, a close ally of Cuba, starting in 2008, whereby thousands have made and are making their way north by land into the United States, where they are mostly automatically admitted. Two, by changes to Cuba's migration law beginning January 2013, permitting travel without an exit permit. And three, beginning in 2009, by the Obama administration's comprehensive relaxation of travel and remittance regulations under the embargo. I estimate that in 2015 alone, at least 92,000 Cubans were admitted into the United States, 43,159 during fiscal year 2015 by all points of entry without prior entry visas. Since 2008, at least 325,000 Cubans have come, with the trend rising exponentially in the last few years. With those numbers, we can only imagine that revenues will only grow for the regime to solidify itself and continue repressing. Regarding forced labor and sex trafficking, the following are also taking place in Cuba. The prostitution of girls just 16 years old on the streets, but also in schools with the participation of teachers and even the complicity of authorities, apparently maintained to increase Cuba's attraction as a tourism destination. The uncompensated labor of prisoners and child labor, particularly in agricultural fields. The government states that this is voluntary labor. Because most Cuban workers, migrants, minors put to work, and prostitutes seemingly consent to the practice for different reasons, this doesn't mean that it's not trafficking. It's important to clarify that the trafficking in persons protocol states the consent of the victim to the intended exploitation is irrelevant once it is demonstrated that deception, coercion, force, or other prohibited means have been used. In addition, the definition of trafficking in person includes the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person for the purpose of exploitation. Finally, number 4, Cuba has been exporting, at least since 1995, an average of $30 million a year in blood products in international markets, mostly, it seems, to state entities within the countries that are close allies. This is done without consent from volunteer or coerced donors in Cuba, tricked into believing their donations are for altruistic purposes. In the 1960s, Cuba drained the blood from prisoners awaiting execution, including at least one American, Robert Fuller, in October of 1960. It reportedly sold it to countries such as Vietnam. We at Cuba Archive have also published reports of the sale by Cuba to Brazil, rising to around $80 million in 2013, of human tissue glands and other body parts of unknown origin, as well as unreported cases of suspected deaths or the plundering of bodies to harvest body parts that are suggestive of state sponsorship. We strongly encourage our government and that of other countries to investigate this. The committee also seeks to examine, are there glaring gaps in prosecuting traffickers, preventing trafficking, or protecting victims? Because in this case, the main perpetrator of the trafficking is in fact the Cuban state, directly or indirectly. Rather than gaps, I see a huge black hole into which the victims fall systematically and mostly hopelessly with little international awareness or support. In Cuba, there is no legal protection for victims or individual or collective rights outside of those allowed by the Communist Party. What's worse, these victims serve a dictatorship all around the world in blatant violation of international law is an open, accepted, and even encouraged fact. few international mechanisms of protections and redress have been put in place. Some of the temporary workers find safe haven in the countries where they serve, and especially health professionals to the U.S. under the Cuban Medical Professional Parole Program since 2006 that has welcomed 7,117 applicants through 2015. The program, which Cuba fiercely denounces, is under review now as part of the normalization of our bilateral relations with Cuba. Meanwhile, we, our own government, our own country, has started to support or cooperate with Cuba's medical brigades in Haiti and last year in the West African countries fighting Ebola. As we have seen above, it is hard to understand how any informed analysis of Cuban reality could lead to the conclusion that Cuba has improved its record of human trafficking. My written testimony is much more extensive and includes substantive data. I respectfully request that it be taken into consideration and entered into the record. Thank you.
Ms. Werlau, thank you very much for your testimony. Without objection, your statement and all of the others will be made a part of the record in their entirety, as I indicated earlier. Let me ask you, begin first with Ambassador Legon. And again, thank you for your extraordinary insights on Cuba. And I think your testimony is the most expansive, authoritative that we've had years to date. And I have, as Ambassador Legon knows, chaired dozens of these hearings, both while we were preparing the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and two of its follow-ons that I authored, and the oversight hearings that we held both before and after the tip reports were handed down by state that you have provided. I've read the tip report for Cuba as well as the other countries in question. There is much that you have suggested be included that they need to seriously take under their wings, including that statement you said about the child sex tourism and the confidential report by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, in which you said ratify that Cuba is one of the primary tourist destinations for sex tourism that includes minors of both genders. It appears that the child prostitution rings are maintained and promoted to increase Cuba's attraction as a tourism destination. Over 1 million Canadians, you point out, visit Cuba each year. And Ambassador Legon, you might want to speak on this as well, because when Cuba was a Tier 3, obviously we knew much of this. We didn't have that report was occurring. I remember being at the UN Human Rights Council with a great leader of Cuban human rights who had actionable information about what was happening with child sex tourism in Cuba. And as a result of this, some Cuban thugs knocked him out. Van pulled up and hit him right in the jaw and knocked him out. And so this is a land of the Gulag and a Potemkin village as well. And it's about time our State Department and our President take seriously this substantive information. So you have provided that, and you might want to speak to that, Ambassador Legon.
Cuba, first of all. I said in my testimony, and a bit more elaborately in the written version, that one of the reasons that I think the ranking for Cuba in last year's report was suspect is this proactive effort to sell the sex market in Cuba to an international buyer base. I wrote a piece in the Washington Post on February the 1st saying that it's time to address the sex trafficking issue through dealing with demand. And it's one thing when there are so-called Johns that are let off the hook while those who are in prostitution or who are trafficked are punished. But when a state is involved in a proactive policy to encourage people to travel and treat women as commodities, it is a hazard zone for trafficking.
Ms. Werlau, if I could address some of the Cuban issues. The Trafficking Victims Report says the government took no action to address forced labor. as if you say you're going to do nothing and take no action, it doesn't exist, which is foolish beyond words. And yet they were upgraded from Tier 3 to watch list. So my question, if you could speak to it, you did in your testimony, but it would be worth some reiteration, because you did speak about the whole issue of doctors and others being compelled, and the huge profits gleaned for the Cuban government. What happens if a physician or a health professional says, no, I'm not going to be deployed somewhere around the world, and how much money does this actually bring into the government by forcing them to do so?
Sorry, let me preface this by saying that for 2 years in a row, the State Department Office for Trafficking in Persons has called me to inquire specifically about the situation of the doctors. And I had had long conversations that are partly reflected in the report, but they sustained for 2 years in a row that these are allegations. And I have interviewed dozens of doctors who don't know each other, who've served in different countries, that repeat the same thing over and over. We have more than 7,000 testimonies taken in our embassies all over the world. And, you know, before these visas are issued for the Cuban Medical Professional Parole Program, these people are interviewed. So I've told them, go, you know, to the embassies, or just get on a plane and go to Miami and find, you know, doctors walking around. They will tell you that this is not an allegation. This is happening systematically. So I'm dumbfounded by this approach.
So they're hiding in plain sight.
I mean, there's thousands of these doctors all over the world enduring these conditions and this situation. And the report it says that the Cuban government is the dominant employer. What it doesn't say is that it's the sole employer of medical professionals. So these people have no choice. But you were asking about what happens if doctors refuse to serve. I've asked about that, and some doctors have told me that they're punished, they're sent to a little clinic in the mountains, etc. But most doctors want to serve, and there's a corruption going on within the state mechanisms employed to recruit these doctors, because certain destinations are more palatable than others. It's certainly better to go to Portugal or Uruguay, or, you know, even some areas of Brazil, than to go to the jungle in, you know, Central America or remote areas of Africa. So actually, again, I mean, this goes back to these people want to serve because they want to improve their lot in life, and whereas a doctor in Cuba earns around $60 a month, then they get a little bonus in hard currency. They're able to see the world. They're able to, you know, save some money to repair the roof in their house when they come back. They get certain rewards, etc. So it's a unique situation.
A reciprocity, so we know when these folks are traveling to the United States. That's now law. It's not a bill, it's a law. And the hope is that now that there's an opening with Cuba, that when anyone seeks to travel to Cuba, we know it's been a destination for child sex tourism. The man I mentioned earlier, Frank Calzone, the one that was knocked out by a sucker punch, he had serious documentation of this. And my hope is that our new embassy will be robust, aggressive in trying to track down the parameters of this horrific entanglement of pimps and the government, often one and the same, and does not whitewash it, which I'm very worried that they may do. So if you would speak to the issue of child sex tourism and sex tourism in general to Cuba.
That's not my area of expertise. However, I have read about it, talked to people about it, and I reference in my written testimony an amazing documentary that was filmed in Cuba and that has great evidence, and everybody should see. The person who filmed it was then put in prison by Cuba, and it took several years before the Spanish government was able to get him out. So this is happening, and he has the evidence, and I think it's a horrific thing that is only going to probably increment with the increase in tourism that we're seeing in Cuba. And now, probably people from the United States will be participants, as the Italians, Canadians, and others that are going to Cuba for this.
Okay, now let me go to Cuba. Does any of the witnesses here believe that the economic awakening, opening, whatever we want to call it, with Cuba right now, is that going to help or hurt in efforts for folks to get treated in a humane, dignified way?
If I may begin, but I really want to defer to my colleague, Ms. Werlau. I think that the record is clear that there have not been changes since the diplomatic opening in human rights in general. Anything more than the most minor economic reforms haven't changed a whit. At this, a predecessor hearing held by Chairman Smith, looking at those, rankings that were considered politicized in the 2015 report, we heard witnesses from the State Department say, now there's more information available from Cuba because we're having diplomatic dialogue with them. So we have better information and we can tell that they're Tier 2 watch lists rather than Tier 3. I think that's rich.
Ms. Joe? Thank you, Ambassador.
Respond on Cuba? Yes. Congressman, I have long favored exchanges that make sense and policies that advance the interests of the United States, and have for a long time argued that our policy towards Cuba, which I consider schizophrenic and contradictory in many aspects of it, different aspects of it, needed a revision. However, I strongly feel that lending credibility, legitimacy, and impunity to a criminal dictatorship without conditions and making unilateral concessions is very troubling and counterproductive to our own interests. The idea that commercial engagement, and including tourism, is going to bring about reforms in Cuba has already been tried. First, by the rest of the world that has been investing, trading, and sending tourists to Cuba for over 20 years since the fall of the Soviet bloc and massive subsidies, and Cuba had to restructure its economy, etc. For example, more than 1 million Canadian tourists go to Cuba every year, and this has been going on for years. I don't see a whole lot of difference between Canadian and U.S. tourists. And second, because there have been for years many exceptions to the embargo, including from 1988, the Berman Amendment that has allowed the free sale and exchange of informational material, videos, music, artwork, etc. No Cubans can buy directly from the United States. It's the same thing with the agricultural products and medical products that have been exempt since 2000. The Cuban government controls all those imports from the United States.
Let me interrupt you. So are you saying there's going to be more or less trafficking of kids and women, etc., with what we're doing now? More or less?
My prediction is more, because there will be more tourists and we'll be participating. And it's one state that is behind, I described the judicial system.
So the Melia hotel chain from Spain on Varadero Beach and other places has not done anything but make the problem. I'm not disputing it. I'm just making sure we're clear.
I have found no instance of any reform from those exchanges.
And if a representative of the Obama administration were here today, he would say, what we've done ain't working, so if we try this, you would be wrong and the rest of the folks up here would be wrong. Is that right?
Well, I think that what we've done was not working. As I said, the policy had many contradictions. It was schizophrenic, and we were not able or not interested in pushing a multilateral approach that made sense with our allies and partners, other democracies that would like to see and would benefit from having a stable and prosperous Cuba.
Raul Castro said, there are no political prisoners. Give me a list of political prisoners. And I will release them before tonight ends. That's the Spanish translation of what he said, the English translation of the Spanish. And Jim Acosta, thank God he asked that question, because one of the few times any of the Castro brothers have ever been asked a serious question about human rights. And that culture of denial, which we see now on the trafficking side, forced labor, they trivialize, if not even respond to any questions about sex trafficking. My hope is that there will be a much more robust effort by the tip office, and I think while they may get it right, hopefully as it goes up the ranks, they will do their work to ensure that Tier 3 designation, which I think is absolutely warranted based on the record, is conveyed again to the government of Cuba. And I do hope they listen to you even more carefully, Maria, as you convey these important points to them at the tip office itself. Ms. Werlau, in her testimony, said that the Cuban government is likely one of the largest and most profitable trafficking promoters in the world. Does that comport, again, with your sense of Cuba?
Well, there's kind of a correlate of the main theme of my testimony. The main theme of my testimony is that democratic governance, rule of law, access to justice, if they are in place in a country, it's more likely that country will do a good job fighting human trafficking. At the other end of the spectrum, if it's not only an autocracy, but a command economy with an intrusive state-led role and forms of forced labor or punitive labor, particularly against those who are not favored by the government, that are institutionalized, that's quite likely to be a driver of human trafficking. But the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, as you shaped, emphasizes the complicity of government officials in human trafficking. Well, if we look at some diplomat who is engaging in the abuse of their domestic servant, that's complicity. But if a government has policies which are in fact contributing to running forced labor, that's the most flagrant form of state complicity that you can see.